Commander Jake Morrison stood at the center of the UES Titan's command bridge, his weathered hands gripping the metal railing as he stared at the holographic display floating before him. The distress signal had been playing on repeat for the last 6 hours, and each time it sent a chill down his spine 3 star systems away. An entire civilization was crying out for help. The bridge hummed with quiet activity. Officers moved between stations, their faces lit by the blue glow of computer screens outside the massive viewport. Stars stretched endlessly in all directions, but Jake's attention was focused on the desperate message that had somehow found its way across the void. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez sat hunched over her communications console, her fingers dancing across holographic keyboards as she worked to decode the alien transmission. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air circulating through the ship. This was the moment every communications officer dreamed of and feared: first contact with an alien species. "Admiral," Amy called out, her voice cutting through the bridge's ambient noise. "I've got something." Admiral Tom Bradley stepped forward from his command chair at 62 years old. Bradley had seen more combat than most officers would see in 3 lifetimes. The scars on his left temple told the story of the Martian border wars, where he'd earned his reputation as a man who never left anyone behind. His gray eyes held the weight of countless decisions, and today would add another to that burden. "What do you have, Lieutenant?" Bradley's voice was calm, measured. His crew looked to him for strength, and he never let them down. Amy's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the translation parameters. The software finally cracked their language patterns. It's taken hours to piece together, but their basic sentence structure is similar to ancient Earth languages. The species calls themselves the Vexari Trade Union. The holographic display shifted, showing a rough map of a distant star cluster. Red markers indicated destroyed planets, while yellow ones showed colonies under immediate threat. The scale of destruction was staggering. They're under attack by something called the Krex Armada, Amy continued, her voice growing more serious with each word. "From what I can understand, these Krex aren't interested in conquest or negotiation. They're destroying everything in their path." Commander Morrison moved closer to the display, studying the tactical information as the ship's tactical officer. He'd spent years analyzing enemy movements and strategies. What he saw here made his blood run cold. "Admiral, this isn't random piracy or territorial expansion. This looks like systematic extermination." Bradley nodded grimly. He'd suspected as much from the tone of the distress calls. There was something in the alien voices, a desperation that went beyond fear of defeat. This was the sound of a species facing extinction. "How bad is it, Lieutenant?" Bradley asked, though he suspected he already knew. The answer: Amy's fingers flew over her console, pulling up more data from the transmission. Their entire defense fleet was destroyed 3 days ago. 17 colonies have been completely wiped out. No survivors. No infrastructure left behind. The Krex don't take prisoners or leave witnesses. The bridge fell silent, except for the quiet hum of life support systems. Every officer present understood the implications. Somewhere across the galaxy, billions of innocent beings were about to die, and their final act was to send out a desperate plea for help to anyone who might listen. "They estimate 2 weeks before their homeworld falls," Amy continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Admiral, they're not just asking for military assistance. They're asking anyone who receives this message to remember that they existed." Bradley closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of command settle on his shoulders. In his long career, he'd made thousands of tactical decisions. But this was different. This wasn't about protecting human interests or securing trade routes. This was about doing what was right, sir, Amy added, looking up from her console. "They're broadcasting this message on every frequency they can access. They're not being selective about who might receive it. They're just hoping someone, somewhere, will care enough to help." Bradley opened his eyes and looked around his bridge. These men and women had followed him through 3 major conflicts, trusted his judgment when the odds seemed impossible. Today, he was about to ask them to risk everything for people they'd never met. For a species they'd just learned existed, Lieutenant. Send a message to Admiral Kate Stevens with the 7th Fleet and Commander Ryan Cole with Strike Group Alpha. Tell them to prepare for immediate deployment. Bradley's voice carried the authority that had earned him the loyalty of thousands of sailors over the years. Commander Morrison stepped forward. Admiral, we're talking about traveling into completely unknown space to fight an enemy we know nothing about. The Krex could have technology far beyond anything we've encountered. Bradley turned to face his old friend. They'd served together for 15 years, fought side by side in battles that had shaped the course of human expansion into space. Morrison wasn't questioning the decision. He was making sure Bradley had considered all the angles. Jake, you're right, we don't know what we're walking into, Bradley admitted, but I know what happens if we don't try. Those people out there are about to die, and their last hope is that someone received their message and decided to act. The bridge crew exchanged glances, and Bradley could see the determination growing in their eyes. This was why they'd joined the fleet, not for glory or advancement, but to stand between the innocent and those who would do them harm. Besides, Bradley added with a slight smile, it's been too quiet around here lately. Looks like humanity's about to make first contact. The transformation on the bridge was immediate. Officers straightened at their stations, fingers flying over controls as they began preparations for what would become the largest fleet deployment in human history. They all knew what happened when someone threatened innocent civilians in human space. Now, the galaxy was about to learn what humans did when innocent civilians were threatened anywhere. The UES Meridian sliced through the void like a silver needle, its sleek hull catching the twin suns light as it approached the massive alien space station. Admiral Tom Bradley stood at the observation deck, watching their destination grow larger. Through the reinforced windows, the Vexery capital station was unlike anything humans had ever built, a sprawling, crystalline structure that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Captain Lisa Parker stood beside him, reviewing the first contact protocols on her tablet at 35. She was one of the youngest captains in the fleet, but her sharp mind and steady nerves had earned her the position as Bradley's aide today. She would help make history as humanity's first official contact with an alien civilization. Admiral, we're receiving docking clearance from the station, called out Lieutenant Commander David Chen from the bridge. They're directing us to Base 7. Looks like they've cleared the entire Section 4. Our arrival. Bradley nodded, straightening his dress uniform. The weight of representing all of humanity pressed on his shoulders. But he'd faced worse pressure in combat, at least here. Everyone wanted the same thing. Survival. The docking process took 20 minutes, with both human and Vexery technicians working carefully to ensure compatibility between their different systems. As the airlocks sealed and atmosphere equalized, Bradley felt his heart rate increase slightly. Beyond that door waited beings from another world, another evolution entirely. The docking bay doors opened with a soft hiss, and Bradley stepped onto alien soil. For the first time in human history, the gravity was lighter than Earth's standard, making each step feel almost bouncy. The air had a faint metallic taste, but was breathable, just as their sensors had indicated. The Vexery delegation waited in formation near the center of the bay. Bradley had seen the preliminary scans, but witnessing them in person was something else entirely. They stood nearly 7 feet tall, with lean builds that suggested grace rather than strength. Their most striking feature was their skin. It looked like living crystal, translucent and shifting through different colors as they moved. Their leader stepped forward with movements that seemed more like dancing than walking when he spoke. His voice had a musical quality that the universal translator struggled to render into English. Humans. The translation came through clear, but somehow missing the melody of the original words. I am first speaker, Veltar, of the Vexery Trade Union. We are grateful beyond words that you answered our call for aid. Bradley stepped forward and extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting. Veltar looked at the offered hand with curiosity, his skin shifting to what appeared to be pale blue patterns. After a moment's hesitation, he reached out and grasped Bradley's hand with his own crystalline fingers. First speaker I'm Admiral Tom Bradley, of the United Earth Space Force. We received your distress signal, and came as quickly as we could. Bradley's voice carried the confidence of a man who'd never lost a battle. He was determined to win. Captain Parker stepped forward, her diplomatic training taking over first speaker. We understand you're facing an existential threat. We're here to help. But we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Veltar's skin shifted to deeper blue patterns, and other Vexari in the delegation began showing similar color changes. Their universal translator noted this as signs of worry and fear. The Krex Armada is unlike anything we have encountered in our 3,000 years of space travel, Veltar explained, his melodic voice taking on urgent tones. They do not seek conquest or resources. They simply destroy everything in their path. Our defensive fleets were annihilated in mere hours. Bradley exchanged a glance with Captain Parker. They'd both read the intelligence reports during the journey, but hearing it directly from the survivors made it more real. How many ships are we talking about? Bradley asked, his tactical mind already working on the problem. Our scouts counted over 800 battlecruisers before they were destroyed. Each one is the size of our largest space stations. They carry weapons that can crack planets. Veltar's skin had shifted to darker patterns that the translator identified as deep fear. Captain Parker consulted her tablet, pulling up the fleet deployment numbers. First speaker. We're bringing 400 ships from our 3rd Fleet alone. Admiral Kate Stevens is mobilizing our 7th Fleet, and Commander Ryan Cole's strike group is already en route from the outer colonies. The change in the Vexari delegation was immediate. Their skin patterns shifted rapidly between colors the translator couldn't identify. Several of them began what appeared to be urgent whispered conversations among themselves. Forgive me, Veltar said carefully, but we must ask about your military capabilities. Your ship appears quite compact compared to what we expected. Are you certain your fleet can match Krek's firepower? We do not wish to see another species destroyed because we gave them false hope. Bradley couldn't help but smile at that. The Vexari were clearly peaceful traders, who thought in terms of bigger always being better. They had no concept of human military engineering or the lessons learned from centuries of warfare on a planet where everything was trying to kill. You, Captain Parker, caught the Admiral's expression and had to suppress her own smile. She'd seen the specifications for the ship's heading. Their way the Vexari were about to get quite a surprise. First speaker. I appreciate your concern for our safety, Bradley said diplomatically, but I think you might be surprised by what human military engineering can accomplish. We've learned to build our ships for maximum efficiency and firepower. One of the younger Vexari in the delegation stepped forward, his skin showing bright yellow patterns. The translator marked his curiosity mixed with skepticism. Admiral Bradley, with respect, the Krex battlecruisers are 15 kilometers long and carry enough firepower to sterilize continents. How can smaller vessels possibly compete? Captain Parker leaned forward slightly. Sir, perhaps we should show them the weapon specifications for the Leviathan-class dreadnoughts. Bradley shook his head with a slight grin. Not yet, Captain. Let's keep that as a surprise. Sometimes the best part of first contact is showing new friends what humans are really capable of. The Vexari delegation looked confused, their skin shifting through patterns that suggested they couldn't quite understand human confidence in the face of overwhelming odds. They had no way of knowing that humans had been fighting overwhelming odds since they first picked up sticks to defend themselves from predators. Soon they would understand exactly why Earth had produced the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Dr. Alex Chen sat cross-legged on the floor of the Vexari research lab, his laptop balanced on his knees as he scrolled through Earth's geological history. The alien laboratory was a marvel of crystalline technology, with holographic displays floating in midair and workstations that seemed to grow from the floor itself. But what fascinated him most was his research partner, a Vexari scientist named Corvin, whose skin had been shifting through increasingly agitated color patterns for the past hour. So you see, Alex said, pointing at a graph showing Earth's temperature fluctuations over the last million years. Our planet goes through these regular cooling periods, where most of the continents get covered in ice sheets. Several miles thick, Corvin's crystalline fingers trembled as he manipulated his own holographic display, cross-referencing Alex's data with the Galactic database of planetary classifications. His skin had shifted from the pale green of curiosity to the orange patterns that indicated deep concern. Dr. Chen. Corvin's melodic voice carried a note of disbelief through the translator. You are telling me your species survived multiple ice ages? Periods where your planet's average temperature dropped by 20 degrees or more? Oh, that's nothing, Alex chuckled. Pulling up another file, the ice ages were just the regular stuff. We also had to deal with supervolcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and magnetic pole reversals. There was this one time about 74,000 years ago when a volcano in Indonesia nearly wiped out our entire species, reduced the human population to maybe 10,000 individuals. Commander Mike Rodriguez had been quietly monitoring the conversation from his position near the lab's security station as the fleet's intelligence officer. He found the cultural exchange fascinating, but he couldn't help but notice how the scientists' distress seemed to increase with every new piece of information about Earth. Don't forget the Yellowstone supervolcano, Doc. Mike called out from across the lab. That thing erupts every 600,000 years or so, creates volcanic winters that last for decades. Corvin's skin suddenly shifted to deep purple patterns that rippled across his crystalline surface like waves. Alex had learned enough about Vexery color language to recognize this as their equivalent of absolute terror. Wait, Corvin held up his hands, his voice rising in pitch. You mean these catastrophic events are still happening? This Yellowstone volcano could erupt at any time. Alex shrugged casually. Yeah, we're actually overdue for an eruption, but don't worry about it. Humans are pretty good at adapting. We've survived 5 major extinction events so far. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger, you know. The Vexery scientist stood abruptly, his movements jerky with agitation. He began pacing around the lab, his skin cycling rapidly through colors that Alex's translator identified as combinations of fear, amazement, and something that might have been respect. Dr. Chen, I must ask you something, and please understand this question comes from scientific curiosity, not disrespect. Corvin paused in his pacing. What classification is your homeworld in our galactic database? Alex tilted his head thoughtfully. I'm not sure. What's the scale? Class 1 through Class 12, with Class 1 being garden worlds with no natural dangers, and Class 12 being Corvin's voice trailed off being what? Alex prompted. Being planets so hostile that complex life should not be able to evolve, let alone achieve sentience and space travel. Corvin's skin had settled into a steady deep purple. Dr. Chen, Earth is classified as a Class 12 death world. We assumed it was an error in our database. Alex's eyes widened with genuine surprise. Then he broke into a huge grin. Really? That's actually kind of cool. What's the highest classification that's produced spacefaring species before? Class 7, Corvin whispered. And that species required genetic modification and environmental suits just to survive on their own planet. Commander Rodriguez had been listening intently, and now he walked over to join the conversation. Doc, you might want to tell him about the predators we had to compete with. Alex's grin grew even wider. Oh right, Corvin. You should know that humans didn't just survive the environmental disasters. We also had to compete with some pretty impressive predators. Saber-toothed cats with fangs that could punch through bone, cave bears that weighed over 1,000 pounds, giant wolves that hunted in packs, and don't forget the smaller stuff. Rodriguez added helpfully venomous snakes, poisonous spiders, disease-carrying insects, and sharks that have been perfecting their killing techniques for 400 million years. Corvin had stopped moving entirely, his crystalline form frozen as he processed this information. You evolved alongside creatures that actively hunted your species. Well, yeah, Alex said matter-of-factly. That's why humans are so good at pattern recognition, threat assessment, and working together under pressure. We spent hundreds of thousands of years learning to outthink things that were bigger, stronger, and faster than us. A soft chiming sound interrupted their conversation, and Corvin moved to one of the crystalline workstations. His skin shifted to new patterns, pale blue mixed with streaks of silver. Dr. Chen, Commander Rodriguez. Corvin's voice was barely above a whisper. I believe you should see this. They joined him at the workstation, which displayed a view of space outside the research station. Alex felt his breath catch in his throat. Ships were arriving, dozens of them, with more appearing every few minutes as they dropped out of hyperspace. But these weren't the sleek, elegant vessels that characterize most galactic civilizations. These ships looked like they'd been built for war, by people who understood that war meant accepting terrible losses to achieve victory. They bristled with weapon emplacements. Their hulls were thick with armor plating that could withstand direct hits from planetary defense systems. Those are human ships? Corvin asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. That's the Third Fleet, Rodriguez confirmed, pride evident in his voice. Admiral Kate Stevens, 7th Fleet. Should start arriving tomorrow. Alex watched as more ships continued to materialize in space around the station. Each one was a testament to human engineering philosophy. If something might go wrong, build it stronger. If the enemy might have better weapons, bring more ships. If the odds are against you, make sure your victory costs them everything they have. Corvin, Alex said gently, noting the Vexeries' continued purple coloration. I think you're beginning to understand something important about humans. Yes, Corvin replied, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror. You are not victims of your violent world. You are its product outside the viewport. The human fleet continued to grow, each ship carrying warriors forged in the crucible of Earth's endless challenges. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when a Class 12 Deathworld finally reached for the stars. The Krex Armada dropped out of hyperspace like a swarm of metal locusts, their massive ships blotting out the stars as they moved into the Vexery system. For 3 months, they had swept through this sector of the galaxy, leaving nothing but dead worlds and empty space behind them. 17 civilizations had fallen before their overwhelming firepower, and today they expected to add the Vexery homeworld to that list. Admiral Zeekmer stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Bone Crusher, a dreadnought so large it had its own weather systems at 12 kilometers long and bristling with enough weapons to sterilize continents. It was the crown jewel of the Krex war machine. Around it, 799 other warships moved in perfect formation, their dark hulls reflecting the light of the Vexery binary suns. Lord Admiral, his tactical officer reported, we detect approximately 400 vessels defending the system. They appear to be small. Zeekmer's mandibles clicked in amusement. The Vexery had found allies, but it didn't matter in 3 months of conquest. No force had lasted more than 6 hours against the Krex Armada. But on the bridge of the UES Leviathan, Fleet Admiral Kate Stevens was studying the enemy formation with the cold calculation of someone who had spent 30 years learning how to kill things efficiently at 55. She was a veteran of the Centauri Rebellion and the Outer Colony wars, conflicts that had taught humanity valuable lessons about fighting against overwhelming odds. Captain Brian Thompson stood beside her, coordinating the human battle line with quick, precise orders. The human fleet looked tiny compared to the Krex Armada. Their largest ships were barely a tenth the size of the enemy dreadnoughts. But size, as humans had learned long ago, wasn't everything. Admiral, Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Hayes called from the tactical station. Enemy fleet is moving into what appears to be standard intimidation formation. They're broadcasting on all frequencies. The translation came through moments later, rendered in the harsh, guttural language of the Krex. Unknown vessels, you have 10 minutes to surrender unconditionally, or be destroyed. Your resistance is futile. Submit now, and your deaths will be swift. Stevens felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear. She'd faced fear before, and learned to use it as fuel. This was something else entirely. This was the focused rage that came when someone threatened innocent people, and then had the arrogance to demand surrender. "Signal the fleet," Stevens said, her voice carrying across the bridge with deadly calm. "All ships. Weapons-free battle stations. Show these aliens what happens when they threaten civilians." The transformation across the human fleet was immediate. Ships that had seemed small and insignificant suddenly bristled with weapon ports opening, shield generators spinning up to full power, and launch tubes flooding with fighters and torpedo spreads. The humans had spent the journey here studying every piece of data about Krek's tactics and technology, and they'd prepared accordingly. Battle began when the Kreks opened fire with their massive plasma cannons, expecting to vaporize the first line of human ships in a single volley. What they got instead was a lesson in human defensive engineering. The human ships didn't try to avoid the incoming fire. They absorbed it with shield systems designed to handle the output of small stars, then kept coming. Commander Ryan Cole led Strike Group Alpha straight into the heart of the Krek's formation, his ships taking hits that should have destroyed them outright. But human ships were built by people who understood that war meant accepting damage to inflict damage, and every vessel in his group kept fighting even as their hulls glowed red-hot from enemy fire. All ships, ramming speed. Cole's voice rang out over the comm as his flagship, the UES Retribution, lost its main engines to a Krek's plasma blast. Instead of retreating, he used the ship's momentum to crash directly into a Krek's cruiser, detonating his remaining torpedo payload on impact. The explosion took out 3 enemy ships and sent debris flying into the Krek's formation. But Cole's sacrifice was just the beginning. Across the battlefield, human ships that had taken fatal damage were using their final moments to maximum effect, ramming enemy vessels or self-destructing at point-blank range. The Kreks had never seen anything like it in their 3,000 years of conquest. Enemies always tried to preserve their ships and crews. They retreated when damaged, surrendered when outnumbered, and valued survival over victory. Humans did the exact opposite. When Krek's boarding parties managed to breach human ships, they found themselves facing something even worse. Marines like Sergeant First Class David Wilson had spent years training for close-quarters combat in zero gravity, learning to fight in conditions that would kill most species they moved through. Their own damaged ships like predators in their natural habitat, using every corridor and maintenance shaft as a weapon. Corporal Nina Santos led her squad through the twisted wreckage of Deck 7 aboard the EU's Thunderbolt, hunting the Krek's boarding party that had just blown a hole in their hull. The aliens were larger and better armed, but they'd made the mistake of entering a human ship where humans made the rules. "Contact front," Santos called out as her squad rounded a corner to find 6 Krek's warriors in powered armor. The aliens opened fire with weapons that could punch through tank armor, but Santos and her Marines had already taken cover behind blast barriers that had been specifically designed for this scenario. The firefight that followed was brutal and close range, with humans using their superior knowledge of their own ship's layout to outmaneuver enemies who were physically stronger but tactically unprepared. For opponents who treated their own death as an acceptable outcome if it meant completing the mission back on the main battlefield. Admiral Stevens watched as the Krek's formation began to waver. Their massive ships were powerful, but they'd been designed to fight enemies who played by the same rules they did. Humans had thrown out the Galactic rulebook and written their own, and it was working. "Admiral," Captain Thompson reported, "Krek's fleet is attempting to withdraw. Should we pursue?" Stevens smiled grimly as she watched enemy dreadnoughts trying to flee from ships a fraction of their size. The Krek's armada had finally met an opponent that scared them more than they scared others. "Negative. Captain, let them run, but make sure they understand if they ever threaten innocent civilians again, they'll find us waiting." The age of Krek's dominance was over. The age of human protection had begun. 3 days after the battle, the Vexery system looked like a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered dreams. Debris from hundreds of Krek's warships drifted through space, Their dark hulls now cold and lifeless. Admiral Tom Bradley stood in what used to be the command center of the Krek's flagship Bonecrusher, breathing recycled air through his environmental suit as he surveyed the destruction. The massive ship had been split nearly in half by a concentrated bombardment from human dreadnoughts. Its interior corridors, now open to the vacuum of space emergency lighting, cast eerie shadows across the alien architecture, and the occasional spark from damaged systems reminded everyone that they were standing inside a tomb that had once held thousands of enemy warriors. Captain Lisa Parker moved carefully through the wreckage beside him, her boots magnetized to the deck plating to keep her anchored in the zero-gravity environment. She carried a portable scanner, documenting everything they found for the intelligence reports that would shape humanity's understanding of their first major galactic enemy. Admiral, she said, her voice crackling through the comm system. The final casualty reports are coming in. We lost 43 ships and over 12,000 personnel. But the Krek's losses are— She paused, checking her readings again. Sir, we destroyed, or disabled, over 700 of their vessels. The survivors are scattered across 6 different star systems, fleeing toward the galactic rim. Bradley nodded grimly. The price of victory was always measured in the lives of good people who would never see home again. But those 12,000 had died, protecting millions of Vexari civilians who would now live to see another day. It was a trade any human commander would make. But that didn't make it easier to bear. The Vexari delegation approached through the damaged corridor, their crystalline forms moving with the careful grace of beings unaccustomed to zero-gravity environments. First speaker Veltar's skin showed complex patterns that shifted between deep blue gratitude and the lingering purple traces of fear. Even 3 days later, the Vexari were still processing what they had witnessed. Admiral Bradley, Veltar's melodic voice carried clearly through the translation system. Standing here in the ruins of our tormentors, I find myself struggling for words adequate to express our gratitude. The Vexari Union owes humanity a debt that spans generations. The first speaker gestured to the floating debris around them with one crystalline hand. Please accept our offer of territorial rights to this entire sector. These systems are rich in rare minerals and strategic resources. It is the least we can offer to repay what you have done. Bradley removed his helmet, trusting the environmental readings that showed the ship's atmosphere was still breathable in this section. His weathered face showed the exhaustion of a man who had carried the weight of command through humanity's first interstellar war. But his eyes remained sharp and determined. First speaker, I appreciate the offer, but we didn't come here for territory, Bradley said firmly. We came because someone called for help, and helping people is what humans do. We don't charge for doing the right thing. Colonel Amy Foster, the diplomatic corps representative who had arrived with the relief fleet, stepped forward with her ever-present tablet full of treaty proposals and trade agreements. At 42, she had spent her career preparing for the day when humanity would need to establish relationships with alien civilizations. Though she'd never imagined it would begin with a war. However, Foster interjected diplomatically, we would very much like to establish formal trade relations and mutual defense agreements. From what we've learned about this sector, the galaxy has some particularly dangerous neighborhoods that might benefit from cooperative security arrangements. Veltar's skin shifted to brighter patterns that the translation software identified as relief mixed with enthusiasm. Colonel Foster, the Vexari would be honored to formalize such agreements. We have extensive trade networks throughout this region, and our merchant guilds have already expressed interest in human technology and cultural exchange. Captain Parker looked up from her scanner, which had been monitoring long-range communications throughout their conversation. Admiral, we're receiving reports from our deep space monitoring stations. News of the battle is spreading across known space faster than we anticipated. Bradley raised an eyebrow. How much faster? Sir, it appears that several species have been monitoring Krek's movements for months, waiting to see who would finally stop them within hours of our victory. We started receiving first contact requests from over 30 different civilizations. The Galactic Trade Consortium has formally invited humanity to join as a founding military member. The implications of that statement settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Humanity had intended to make quiet first contact with a single species in distress instead. They had announced their arrival to the entire galaxy by defeating the most feared military force in known space. Foster consulted her tablet, scrolling through incoming diplomatic messages. Admiral, we're also receiving formal requests for military assistance from 12 different systems apparently. The Kreks weren't the only aggressive species in this region, and word is spreading that humans are willing to help defend civilian populations. Bradley felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders again. Command had sent him to help one species, but it looked like they'd accidentally committed humanity to becoming the galaxy's unofficial peacekeepers back on the UES Leviathan. Admiral Kate Stevens stood on the bridge, reviewing after-action reports with Captain Brian Thompson. The ship bore scars from the battle, scorched hull plating, replaced viewport sections, and the lingering smell of overheated electronics that reminded everyone how close they'd come to joining the casualty lists. Ma'am, Thompson said, looking up from his damage assessment reports. Command is asking for our recommendations on first contact protocols for future engagements. What should we tell them? Stevens looked out at the debris field that had once been the most powerful fleet in the galaxy, then at the Vexery ships moving among the wreckage to rescue survivors and recover the dead 3 days ago. These people had been facing extinction. Now they were free to rebuild their civilization and choose their own destiny. Tell Command that first contact protocols worked exactly as designed, Stevens said with a slight smile. We identified beings in distress. We responded with appropriate force, and we established positive diplomatic relations. The fact that we had to blow up 700 enemy ships to do it just proves we chose the right species to make friends with. Thompson chuckled as he made notes on his report and the requests for military assistance from other systems. Stevens' expression grew more serious. Tell them, the galaxy just got a lot safer, but it's also gotten a lot more complicated. We're not conquerors, but we're not going to stand by and watch innocent people get slaughtered either. As news of humanity's intervention continued to spread across the galaxy, species that had lived in fear for generations began to hope again. The age of Krek's terror was over, but more importantly, the age of human protection had begun, and for the first time in galactic history, the innocent had guardians who considered their own survival secondary to the mission. The galaxy would never be the same.